Welcome back, everyone, for another deep dive. This time, we're going all the way back to the American Revolution.
The Revolution.
Yeah, with all this 250th anniversary stuff coming up, I figured it was the perfect time.
It's a big one.
Oh, for sure. And the U.S. Army is like right at the center of it all. And they even put out a press release. But all the cool things they're doing for the anniversary.
Yeah, the U.S. Army Center of Military History, the CMH, they're going all out to make sure this anniversary is one to remember.
Yeah, so what are they actually doing? I mean, we're talking about a pretty big anniversary here.
Well, they're kicking off a huge awareness campaign, 18 months long.
Okay, 18 months awareness campaign.
But what does that even mean? Like for your average person who maybe isn't a history expert, but is still curious about this stuff.
Well, I think the CMH is trying to show everyone just how important the Army was to creating this nation. It's a story that sometimes gets lost in all the political drama from that time.
I can see that happening.
Did you know that the Army actually is older than the United States? Wait, really? I always thought it was the other way around. Like we became a country and then created an army to, defend the nation.
Right. That's what most people think. But the Continental Army was actually established on June 14th, 1775. That's over a year before the Declaration of Independence was even signed.
So, wow, over a year. Who made that happen?
Well, the Second Continental Congress, they were basically the governing body for the colonies back then.
Right.
They decided to create the army to fight for independence.
I mean, think about it for a second. The colonies are on edge. They're about to openly rebel against Great Britain.
Right.
And in the middle of all this, they form an army. That's a big statement, don't you think?
Oh, yeah. It was like they were putting their money where their mouth was.
For sure.
And the political climate back then, oh, man, it was complicated. You had the Second Continental Congress trying to handle all these different interests, all these different opinions. Some people still wanted to make peace with Britain, but others wanted complete freedom.
I can only imagine.
Yeah. And it's interesting because forming an army, it kind of showed that. Even before declaring independence, the colonists were already acting like one unified nation, at least when it came to military stuff.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
So besides this awareness campaign, what else is the CMH doing to celebrate this anniversary? Bring it to life for people.
Oh, they're doing a bunch of stuff.
Yeah.
For starters, they had this really cool kiosk exhibit at the 2023 AUSA annual meeting.
AUSA.
The Association of the United States Army.
Gotcha. Okay, so a kiosk exhibit. Was it like one of those boring museum displays, or was it more interactive?
No. It wasn't boring at all. They had interactive elements like a replica Continental Army uniform.
Oh, wow. So you could see what they actually wore.
Yeah, and get this. They even had a Brown Bess musket there, and attendees could actually hold it.
A Brown Bess. What an interesting name. I bet it's pretty different from the rifles you see today.
Oh, yeah, totally different. The Brown Bess was a smoothbore flintlock musket that was like the main firearm for the Continental Army. And accuracy, forget about it. Nowhere near as accurate as the rifles we have today. Imagine trying to hit a target from 50 yards away, much less any further than that.
50 yards? Isn't that like half a football field? That's crazy close.
I know, right? It really shows you how brave those soldiers were, charging into battle with those muskets. This wasn't some video game. It was life or death.
Yeah, no kidding. So this kiosk exhibit sounds pretty cool. A real step back in time. Anything else interesting there?
Oh, yeah, they were handing out these brochures, combo brochures and souvenir battle maps.
Okay, cool.
Yeah, they showed all the major campaigns of the Continental Army.
I'd love to get my hands on one of those. Like a little piece of history.
Yeah.
So speaking of that, how can people actually experience this history?
Yeah.
Like firsthand. Are there any good museums or historical sites that can really bring the revolution to life?
Absolutely. Visiting your local Army museum is a great way to connect with this history. And actually, there's something really exciting happening. The National Museum of the United States Army, they're opening a brand new Revolutionary War exhibit in June 2025.
June 2025. I'm marking that down. I love a good museum trip, and I bet this exhibit is going to be amazing. Okay, but before we get ahead of ourselves, I have to ask about these Brown Bess muskets. What was it like to actually use one in battle?
It was a pretty involved process. Like just reloading a Brown Bess was a whole ordeal. First you had to bite off the end of a paper cartridge.
Bite it off.
Yeah.
You're kidding, right? Talk about dangers. I mean, I'd be more worried about biting my own tongue off in the middle of a battle.
Oh, no, it's crazy, right?
Yeah.
So you bite off the end, and then you pour a little bit of the powder into the pan, and then the rest goes on the muzzle of the musket. Then you got to ram the ball and the paper down the barrel. And all this is happening while you're trying to stay calm with people shooting at you.
That sounds more like a chemistry experiment than loading a gun.
It does, doesn't it? And that's not even all of it. The flintlock mechanism was super unreliable too. Like, it could misfire, especially if it was damp out.
So you're in close range combat. The reload time is forever, and you can't even be sure your gun's going to fire when you need it to. Man, things have really changed in the Army, haven't they?
They really have. And that's just firearms, you know? Think about the uniforms. Today's soldiers have all this specialized gear for different situations, different environments. But back then, the Continental Army, their uniforms were all over the place.
So they weren't really uniform.
Not at all. In the beginning, guys were just wearing whatever they had. Hunting clothes, civilian clothes, you name it. It was a total mix of colors and styles.
I guess fashion wasn't really a priority back then.
I guess not.
So what were some of the biggest challenges when it came to like equipping an army in those days?
Oh man, where do I even start? Imagine trying to get thousands of soldiers everything they needed, clothes, equipment, all while you're in the middle of a war. You're constantly moving, you have limited resources.
Yeah.
That sounds impossible.
It was tough. And then you had to worry about morale too.
Yeah.
You know, if the guys don't look like a unified force, it can really affect their fighting spirit.
Right, morale is huge.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that's actually where the standardized uniforms came in later. They started using more blue and brown colors. And then eventually that iconic blue coat with the buff facings that became really popular, it helped everyone feel like they were part of the same team, you know?
It's amazing how much a uniform can affect how people feel and act.
Yeah, it really is.
But okay, beyond the uniforms and the weapons, how did the Continental Army actually fight the British? I mean, how do you even go up against the strongest military in the world at that time?
They knew they couldn't win a straight up fight, like the kind of battles Europeans were used to.
Right.
They had to be smarter. They had to use their resources wisely, take advantage of what they had.
Okay, so what did that look like?
Well, they started using guerrilla tactics.
Yeah.
You know, stuff like ambushes, hit and run attacks, using the terrain to their advantage.
They were fighting on their home turf after all. They knew those woods, those swamps, those back roads way better than the British did.
So they basically turned being the underdog into an advantage.
Exactly. It was like a real life David and Goliath story. And they had this burning desire for freedom that the British just didn't have. That kind of motivation can make all the difference.
No doubt. It's fascinating how much the Continental Army's tactics changed throughout the war. Were there any big wins they had? You know, the kind that really turned things around?
Oh, yeah. There were a few, but the one that always comes to mind is the Battle of Trenton. It happened on Christmas night, 1776, a real turning point.
Christmas night. Okay, now that's a story I got to hear. What happened?
Well, the Continental Army had been losing a lot. Morale was super low, and a lot of the soldiers, their enlistments were almost up. General Washington knew he needed a big win, something to inspire his troops and the whole country.
Yeah, he needed a miracle.
Right, so he came up with this plan. It was really bold. He wanted to cross the Delaware River in the middle of winter. And I'm talking freezing temperatures, icy conditions. Wow.
And then surprise attack the Hessian troops stationed in Trenton, New Jersey.
Hold on, Hessians. Who are they?
Oh, right, sorry. Hessians were German soldiers. The British hired them to fight in the Revolution.
Ah, okay.
Yeah. And they were known for being really disciplined, really professional soldiers.
So Washington is taking on professional soldiers with a volunteer army, and he decides to attack them on Christmas night. That's some serious strategy.
It was a huge risk, but Washington knew he had the element of surprise. I mean, the Hessians were probably celebrating Christmas, having a feast totally unaware of what was coming.
Yeah, I bet they weren't expecting an attack across a frozen river.
Not at all. And you know what? It worked. Washington and his troops crossed the Delaware in those crazy conditions, launched a surprise attack on Trenton, and they captured almost all of the Hessian troops, plus a ton of supplies.
What a victory. That must have been a huge morale boost for the Continental Army.
It was huge. It showed the world that the Continental Army was a real threat, and it gave everyone new hope for independence.
That's an amazing story. It really shows what the Revolution was all about. Ingenuity, determination, taking risks.
Definitely.
And it shows how important good leadership is. I mean, General Washington, he made a bold decision and he inspired his troops and they won the battle.
Right.
So we've talked about the Brown Bess musket, the early uniforms, the guerrilla tactics, and now the Battle of Trenton. What else can you tell us about the Continental Army? You know, something we might not already know.
One thing that a lot of people don't realize is how important women were to the war effort. They weren't just sitting at home knitting socks.
Yeah, women did so much more than that.
Exactly. They played huge roles in supporting the army. They sewed uniforms, made ammunition, took care of the wounded. They even spied on the enemy.
Wow, that's incredible.
And some women even disguised themselves as men and fought on the front lines.
Wait, seriously, women disguised as men fighting in the revolution. That's amazing. Do we know anything about these women?
Oh yeah, there are quite a few documented cases, actually. One of the most famous is Deborah Sampson. She enlisted in the Continental Army under the name Robert Shirtliff.
Robert Shirtliff.
Yeah, and she served for over a year before they figured out she was a woman.
Wow. Deborah Sampson, what a legend.
Yeah.
It's like you said, history is full of unsung heroes. People who went above and beyond for what they believed in.
It really is, and their stories deserve to be told just as much as the stories of the famous generals and politicians.
I couldn't agree more. It's those personal stories that really make history come alive. Speaking of which, are there any specific anecdotes or stories you find really interesting, something that captures the human side of things?
Oh, there are so many to choose from, but one that I always think about it's about Joseph Plum Martin. He was just a young soldier in the Continental Army, but he kept a diary all throughout the war.
A diary? Wow, that's amazing. Talk about a primary source. What did he write about?
Oh, everything you can imagine. From the everyday stuff in camp, like what they ate, or more accurately, what they didn't eat, to the terrifying stuff, the battles. He wrote about freezing winters, scorching hot summers, the constant worry of getting sick. But the thing that really stands out in his writing is his spirit, his determination to see the fight for independence through.
It's one thing to read about the revolution in a textbook, but to hear it from someone who was actually there, that's got to be powerful.
It really is. His words take you right back to that time. You feel the cold, the hunger, the fear, but you also feel the camaraderie, the hope, the belief in what they were fighting for.
It makes you realize that those historical figures were real people, not just names in a book, but people who laughed and cried and struggled just like us.
Exactly. And there's this one entry where Martin talks about being at Valley Forge during the winter encampment.
Oh, man. Valley Forge. That was a brutal time for the Continental Army. I remember learning about it in school.
Yeah, it was rough. And in this entry, Martin describes huddling around a fire with his fellow soldiers trying to stay warm. They're exhausted, hungry. A lot of them are sick. But then he writes about one of the soldiers starting to sing a song.
A song? In the middle of all that. What kind of song was it?
It was a patriotic song, about freedom and liberty. And pretty soon, other soldiers started joining in their voices, getting louder and louder in the cold night air. Martin writes about how for a brief moment, all their troubles seemed to fade away. They weren't just tired and hungry soldiers anymore. They were brothers united by this cause.
I'm getting chills just thinking about it. It's incredible how music can bring people together, even in the darkest of times. It's a reminder that even when things seem hopeless, there's always something to believe in, something to keep you going.
It really shows the strength of the human spirit, the resilience, and the hope that can survive anything. And it speaks to the power of shared experiences, the bonds that form when people go through tough times together.
We've covered a lot of ground today. The creation of the Continental Army, the challenges they faced, the weapons and tactics they used, the unwavering spirit that drove them to victory. I feel like I have a whole new understanding of the American Revolution and the U.S. Army's role in it.
Me too. It's a story that never gets old.
And as we get closer to the 250th anniversary, it's more important than ever to remember the sacrifices made by those who came before us and to think about the values they fought so hard for.
Definitely. It's a chance to learn from our past and to find inspiration in it.
And for our listeners out there, if you're interested in learning more about this incredible period in American history, be sure to check out your local Army museum. They're full of fascinating information and artifacts.
And don't forget to mark your calendars for June 2025 when the National Museum of the United States Army opens its brand new Revolutionary War exhibit. It's going to be an amazing experience.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the American Revolution and the U.S. Army's role in it, here's something to think about. How has the Army's role in our society changed since the Revolution? What challenges does the Army face today, and what opportunities lie ahead in this rapidly changing world?
Those are great questions. And I think it's important for all of us to have these conversations, to understand the complex role of the military in our society, and to appreciate the sacrifices made by the men and women who serve our country.
Well said. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the past. We encourage you to keep exploring, keep learning, and keep asking questions. Until next time.